Kentucky looks like just another quiet American state, but it's the place where both sides of the Civil War were born, where it literally rained meat from a clear sky, where a bear overdosed on cocaine and became a celebrity, and where a whole city was built inside a meteor crater and nobody noticed for decades. This one state broke more rules, defied more logic, and produced more absolute chaos than most countries combined. And we have 71 facts that are going to make you question everything you thought you knew about America. Smash that hype button right now and send this video to someone who thinks they know Kentucky. Because after this, nobody will ever look at this state the same way again. 1. Kentucky has one of the most jaw-dropping coincidences in all of American history, and almost nobody talks about it. For Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis, the two men who would lead opposite sides of the bloodiest war America ever fought, were both born in Kentucky, less than 100 miles apart and less than 1 year apart in age. One became the president trying to save the Union. The other became the president trying to destroy it. Same state, same soil, same era, completely opposite destinies. 2. When the Civil War broke out, most states had to pick a side, but Kentucky looked at both options and essentially told everyone to leave them alone. The state formally declared itself neutral, which in the middle of an active war was about as realistic as declaring yourself neutral in a bar fight happening in your own living room. Kentucky sent official letters to both Abraham Lincoln and the Confederate government informing them it wanted no part of either side. Both sides ignored Kentucky completely and marched troops through anyway. 3. Kentucky Bend is one of those places that makes you question whether the people who drew America's borders were actually paying attention. This small chunk of Kentucky land sits completely surrounded by Missouri and Tennessee, physically disconnected from the rest of its own state. It exists purely because a surveyor made a mistake centuries ago and apparently nobody wanted to fix it. Only 17 people live there today, and if any of them want to drive to the nearest Kentucky city, they are looking at a 40-mile trip just to reach their own state. 4. Kentucky has more bourbon barrels quietly aging in warehouses than it has actual living human residents. And that fact somehow gets more bizarre the longer you think about it. There are over 5 million barrels of bourbon sitting in rickhouses across this state right now, compared to roughly 4.5 million people walking around. The barrels outnumber the citizens. Kentucky essentially decided at some point that aging whiskey was a higher priority than growing its population, and based purely on the numbers, it appears the bourbon is winning that competition by a comfortable margin. 5. Almost every person alive has sung Happy Birthday, at least once, but almost nobody knows two Kentucky sisters are responsible for the whole thing. Patty and Mildred Hill wrote that song, and a corporation eventually got hold of the copyright and spent decades charging royalties every single time it was performed publicly. Restaurants avoided it. Films paid thousands to use it. See, the entire planet was essentially being taxed for singing a birthday song written by two ladies from Kentucky, until a federal court finally looked at the situation in 2016 and declared the song free. 6. Secretariat is considered the greatest racehorse who ever lived, and after he died, veterinarians discovered something that made that title feel completely obvious. His heart weighed 22 pounds. A normal horse heart weighs around 7 or 8 pounds. Secretariat was essentially running every race with an engine 3 times larger than his competition, and nobody knew it while he was alive. His records from 1973 have never been broken, and scientists who study equine biology still use his heart as a reference point when explaining what a truly extraordinary physical specimen looks like. 7. In 1985, a drug smuggler flying over Kentucky dropped a duffel bag full of cocaine into the woods, thinking he would retrieve it later. A black bear found it first and ate the entire contents before anyone could stop him. The bear died from the overdose and was eventually taxidermied and put on display inside a mall in Lexington, Kentucky, where he sits to this day wearing a permanent expression that can only be described as deeply satisfied. Locals named him Pablo Escobar, and he has since become one of the most visited accidental tourist attractions in the entire state. 8. In 1955, a farming family of 11 people outside Hopkinsville, Kentucky, spent an entire night being terrorized by small glowing creatures they described as floating toward their farmhouse from the fields. The family fired guns at the creatures repeatedly and claimed the bullets had no effect. They eventually fled to the police station in the middle of the night and reported everything in detail. The United States Air Force opened an official investigation and created a case file. Decades later, that same case file was referenced in congressional UFO hearings, making a Kentucky farm family part of official American government record. 9. Kentucky takes its dueling history so seriously that the state never bothered removing the anti-duel oath from its governor inauguration ceremony. Every single person who becomes governor of Kentucky must stand up on their inauguration day and swear before everyone present that they have never participated in a duel with deadly weapons. On this oath was written in an era when politicians were genuinely shooting each other at alarming frequency. The dueling stopped eventually, but the oath stayed. Every Kentucky governor from that era until today has had to look a crowd in the eye and promise they never shot anyone in a field. 10. Middlesboro, Kentucky sits inside a 3-mile-wide crater left behind by a meteor impact, and the residents had absolutely no idea for the longest time. People built streets there, opened businesses, raised families, and went about their entire lives completely unaware that their city was sitting at the bottom of a cosmic collision site. Scientists finally looked at the unusual circular geology in the 1960s and confirmed that a meteor had slammed into that exact spot millions of years ago. Middlesboro is the only city in America built entirely inside a meteor crater, and its residents found out from geologists, not from local history class. 11. In 1888, Kentucky's state treasurer, Richard Tate, walked into the state treasury, helped himself to $250,000 of public money, and then simply disappeared. No dramatic chase, no courtroom drama, no justice served anywhere. Tate had spent years building a reputation so spotless that people literally called him Honest Dick, which in hindsight was doing a lot of heavy lifting. The man vanished completely and was never found, never prosecuted, and never returned a single dollar. Kentucky essentially watched its most trusted financial official rob the entire state and then evaporate into American history forever. 12. Before KFC became a global fast food empire, it was just a man cooking chicken inside a gas station storage room in Corbin, Kentucky. Colonel Harlan Sanders converted the back section of a Shell station into a tiny dining area and was genuinely multitasking in a way no food entrepreneur has attempted since. Customers would pull up, get their gas pumped, and then walk around back to eat chicken Sanders had personally cooked minutes earlier. The operation was so successful that word spread across the region, and what started as a storage room in a Kentucky gas station eventually became one of the most recognized restaurant brands on the entire planet. 13. Kentucky and its neighbors have been arguing about the Ohio River for a very long time, and the argument was essentially settled before most of those states even existed. So a federal ruling in 1792 determined that the Ohio River along Kentucky's border belongs entirely to Kentucky, not to Ohio, Indiana, or Illinois, who are literally sitting on the opposite bank staring at water they do not legally own. Fishermen on the Indiana side are technically fishing in Kentucky water. Boats crossing from Ohio are entering Kentucky jurisdiction. The states on the other side of that river have been living next to water that is not theirs for over 200 years. 14. Kentucky has a law still sitting on its books that makes it completely illegal to bring any reptile into a church service, and the story behind it explains everything. Snake-handling preachers in parts of Kentucky were treating live venomous serpents as a demonstration of religious faith, and the results were exactly as dangerous as any reasonable person would expect. People kept dying during services in front of entire congregations. The state eventually looked at the situation, decided it had witnessed more than enough religious reptile incidents, and passed a law that essentially told every preacher in Kentucky that the snakes were staying outside permanently. 15. Kentucky has a native tree called the Kentucky coffee tree, and it produces seeds that are completely toxic to every living animal currently walking the earth. No bird can eat them, no mammal can process them. Nothing alive today can digest these seeds without being poisoned. The only creatures that could actually eat and spread these seeds were woolly mammoths and mastodons that went extinct roughly 10,000 years ago. That means this tree has been standing in Kentucky producing seeds for 10,000 years with absolutely no animal able to help it reproduce, essentially waiting for a customer that permanently stopped showing up at the end of the last ice age. 16. The Louisville Slugger baseball bat started because an 18-year-old woodworker in Louisville named Bud Hillerick watched a player snap his bat during a game in 1884 and decided he could make a better one by hand. He took the player back to his father's wood shop, turned a replacement on a lathe overnight, and the player used it in his next game and got 3 hits. That single handmade bat launched one of the most iconic sports equipment brands in American history. Today, outside the Louisville Slugger Museum, there is a replica bat standing 120 feet tall and weighing 34 tons, which is a reasonable tribute to a teenager who stayed up late with some wood. 17. In 1876, residents of Bath County, Kentucky, stepped outside on a perfectly clear afternoon and found chunks of raw meat falling from the sky over a stretch of land roughly the size of a tennis court. The meat fell for several minutes, landed on fences and fields, and witnesses confirmed it was real flesh. Scientists who examined the samples identified multiple types of animal tissue. The leading explanation that eventually emerged from the scientific community was that a large group of vultures flying overhead had all vomited simultaneously while in flight, which is either the most disgusting weather event in Kentucky history or the most impressive coordinated bird behavior ever recorded, depending entirely on your perspective. 18. Frankfort is the capital of Kentucky, and it holds a distinction that no other Union state capital can claim. Confederate troops physically marched into Frankfort and occupied it during the Civil War, making it the only capital of a Union-aligned state to be taken by Confederate forces during the entire conflict. The remarkable part is that Kentucky never officially joined the Confederacy. The state had declared itself neutral, was claimed by both sides, and then watched Confederate soldiers walk into its capital city anyway. Frankfort got occupied by a side Kentucky never even formally joined, which is a level of political confusion most states never had to experience. 19. Kentucky has a county named Christian and a county named Bourbon, and geography arranged them in a way that feels personally designed to frustrate people. Christian County is wet, meaning alcohol is legal there. Bourbon County is dry, meaning it is completely illegal to purchase alcohol in the county that shares its name with one of the most famous alcoholic beverages in American history. The county named after a spirit cannot legally sell a spirit. The county named after a virtue is pouring drinks freely. Kentucky essentially flipped its most obvious geographical joke completely upside down and then left it that way permanently. 20. Kentucky has more miles of navigable waterways than every single state in America except Alaska, which is an extraordinary geographic fact for a landlocked state sitting in the middle of the country. Rivers and streams cut through Kentucky in every direction, creating one of the most connected water networks on the continent. Yet despite all that water running through the state, large portions of rural eastern Kentucky had no access to running water inside their homes until the early 2000s. The state was sitting on top of one of the greatest natural water systems in America while entire communities were hauling water by hand well into the 21st century. 21. Kentucky has a law that never got repealed requiring every able-bodied man in the state to physically assist the local sheriff if ordered to help chase down a criminal. This is not a historical curiosity that quietly faded away. The posse law is still technically enforceable today, meaning any sheriff in Kentucky can theoretically walk up to a random man on the street, tell him a criminal is running, and legally require that man to join the pursuit immediately. Kentucky essentially kept a Wild West law alive through every decade of modern civilization and never once looked back at it long enough to remove it from the books. 22. Kentucky hunters wiped out the entire native elk population so completely that by the 20th century not a single wild elk remained anywhere in the state. The animals that had roamed Kentucky for thousands of years were simply gone. In 1997, wildlife officials began reintroducing elk from western states, and what happened next surprised nearly everyone involved. The population exploded. Kentucky's landscape turned out to be so perfectly suited for elk that the herd grew into the largest wild elk population east of the Mississippi River. The state that hunted its elk into total extinction accidentally created the biggest elk comeback story on the eastern half of the continent. 23. Most Americans confidently believe Thomas Edison first showed off the electric light bulb to the public, somewhere in New Jersey near his famous laboratory, and most Americans are completely wrong about that. Edison made his first major public demonstration of electric lighting, not in New Jersey, but at the Southern Exposition held in Louisville, Kentucky in 1883. Thousands of people gathered and watched an entire building light up electrically for the first time in a public setting. The moment that changed how humanity thinks about light and darkness happened in Louisville, and American history textbooks have been quietly leaving Kentucky out of that story ever since. 24. Bobby Mackey's Music World in Wilder, Kentucky is a honky-tonk bar that sits on top of what used to be a slaughterhouse, and before that was reportedly the site of occult rituals performed in the 1890s involving a well in the basement. The building has been investigated by paranormal researchers more times than almost any other structure in America. The staff members have quit over unexplained experiences. Investigators have captured audio and video that nobody has fully explained. The bar kept operating through all of it because Kentucky apparently decided that a history involving slaughterhouses, ritual wells, and decades of paranormal activity was not a sufficient reason to close a perfectly functional music venue. 25. Transylvania University in Lexington, Kentucky sounds like the kind of institution a Hollywood writer invented for a horror film, but it is completely real, fully accredited, and has been educating students since 1780. That makes it the oldest university west of the Allegheny Mountains, predating most American institutions people actually recognize by name. Alumni include multiple United States senators, governors, and vice presidents. The university has spent over 2 centuries trying to be taken seriously while carrying a name that makes every new student explain to their relatives that they are not actually attending school in a Dracula movie. 26. Louisville, Kentucky has been quietly claiming the invention of the cheeseburger since 1934, when a restaurant called Kalen's added a slice of cheese to a hamburger and served it to a customer who apparently had no idea they were witnessing culinary history. A diner in Denver heard about it, filed a patent a year later, and tried to claim the invention for themselves. Kentucky pointed at the dates. Denver pointed at the patent. Nobody ever produced a ruling satisfying enough to settle the argument permanently. The cheeseburger is one of the most consumed foods in American history, and 2 states have been fighting about who deserves credit for it for nearly a century. 27. Barron County, Kentucky has some of the most productive and fertile farmland in the entire state, and has been recognized as one of the best rural places to live in America, which makes its name spectacularly misleading to anyone encountering it for the first time. The name has nothing to do with bad soil or failed crops. Early settlers who arrived found the land completely stripped of trees and vegetation across enormous stretches and assumed the soil was poor. What had actually happened was that massive herds of bison had grazed the area so thoroughly for so long that they had eaten everything down to bare ground, making rich farmland look like wasteland from a distance. 28. Kentucky once had a law requiring women to obtain their husband's written permission before purchasing a hat, and the law was not some relic from the colonial era quickly forgotten in a dusty drawer. It stayed on the books well into the 20th century, meaning women in Kentucky were legally required to get documented spousal approval before acquiring headwear. The hat specifically was named in the legislation as though Kentucky lawmakers had gathered in a room, looked at all the purchases a woman might independently make, and decided that millinery was the one that required the tightest regulatory oversight of any item available for purchase. 29. A man o' war was considered the greatest racehorse of his generation, and when he died in 1947, Kentucky treated his funeral with a level of ceremony normally reserved for heads of state. Over 2,000 people attended in person. The service was broadcast live on radio across the country so that Americans who could not make the trip could still participate in mourning a horse. The farewell man o' war received was more elaborately produced and more publicly attended than the funerals of multiple sitting American presidents from that same era. Kentucky looked at a racehorse and decided the occasion demanded the full national broadcast treatment. 30. Fort Knox sits in Kentucky, holding roughly half of all the gold reserves owned by the United States Treasury, currently valued at over $6 billion. And the last time any outside party was permitted to conduct a full independent audit of that gold was 1953. No outside auditor has been allowed inside since. The President of the United States cannot simply walk into the vault. Congress has requested audits and been denied. The The gold that backs a significant portion of American financial credibility has been sitting in a Kentucky building for decades, and the government's official position on letting anyone verify it is still essentially no. 31. Deep in Breathitt County, Kentucky, there is an abandoned coal mine that has been sitting empty for over 40 years, and it has been visibly smoking the entire time. Underground coal seams caught fire at some point during the mine's operation, and the fire never stopped. It simply kept burning beneath the surface year after year, decade after decade, producing smoke that rises continuously from the ground above it. Engineers and mining experts have examined the situation multiple times and reached the same conclusion every time. The fire burning underneath that Kentucky hillside is considered virtually impossible to extinguish, and will likely keep burning long after everyone alive today is gone. 32. Richmond, Kentucky came extremely close to becoming the capital of the United States, and the reason it lost is almost insultingly simple. When early American leaders were debating where to place the permanent seat of government, Richmond, Kentucky was genuinely on the short list of serious candidates. The location had land, centrality, and enough support to be considered a real contender. It lost the selection purely because it had no seaport access. The founders wanted the capital connected to water trade routes, and Richmond could not offer that. The entire reason Washington, D.C. exists where it does is partially because a Kentucky town did not have a harbor. 33. The hot brown is an open-faced sandwich of turkey and bacon smothered in a rich cheese sauce, and it was invented at the Brown Hotel in Louisville in 1926 under circumstances that explain everything about its late-night appeal. The hotel hosted enormous dinner dances that ended around midnight, and hundreds of guests would flood the kitchen afterward demanding food. Most of them had been drinking heavily for hours. The chef needed something fast, filling, and impressive enough that nobody would complain, and the hot brown was his answer. A Kentucky chef essentially invented a signature dish specifically because his customers kept arriving in the kitchen too intoxicated to wait for anything complicated. 34. Bowling Green. Kentucky has a cave system running directly underneath it that holds 2 world records simultaneously, and most people walking through the city above have no idea either record exists. The Lost River Cave contains the shortest underground river in the world, and also the largest cave entrance east of the Mississippi River. People jog past it, drive over it, and build parking lots near it while an extraordinary geological formation sits beneath their feet. The cave entrance is large enough to boat into, and the underground river inside it runs so briefly that the entire thing fits under a medium-sized neighborhood without anyone above ground noticing. 35. Kentucky lawmakers looked at pinball machines at some point and decided with complete official seriousness that they represented a direct threat to the moral foundation of their communities. The state banned pinball machines for decades, with legislators formally declaring them a gateway to gambling and moral decay in language that treated a steel ball bouncing off rubber bumpers as equivalent to organized crime. Multiple counties enforced the ban actively, and operators who installed machines faced real consequences. Kentucky managed to maintain a statewide position of deep institutional suspicion toward a children's arcade game while the rest of America was busy putting pinball machines in every diner and bowling alley without apparent societal collapse. 36. The Kentucky Derby has been running continuously since 1875, and in all that time, every letter of the alphabet has appeared as the first letter of at least one horse's name entered in the race except one. The letter X has never appeared at the start of a Kentucky Derby horse's name in over 150 years of competition. Every other letter has been covered across thousands of entries spanning generations of breeders, trainers, and owners who named their horses with remarkable alphabetical range. The most famous horse race in America has a complete alphabet with a single missing letter, and that gap has been sitting there quietly for over a century. 37. Fort Mitchell, Kentucky is home to the Vent Haven Museum, which holds the largest collection of ventriloquist dummies in the entire world, and the number currently sits at over 900 individual figures. They are displayed in rows, seated in chairs, staring outward with painted expressions that do not change regardless of the time of day or the number of visitors in the room. The collection was assembled by a single devoted enthusiast over decades and donated to create a permanent museum after his death. Fort Mitchell, Kentucky is technically the place on Earth where more artificial human faces are watching you from fixed positions in a darkened room than anywhere else in the world. 38. Queen Elizabeth II of England made multiple personal trips to Lexington, Kentucky during her reign, and the purpose was not diplomacy, tourism, or any formal state business. She came to visit her horses. The Queen owned thoroughbred racehorses stabled at farms in the Lexington area, and she traveled from Buckingham Palace to central Kentucky specifically to check on them in person. The head of the British monarchy regularly boarded a transatlantic flight to spend time in a Kentucky horse barn, and local farm workers had the experience of looking up from their daily chores to find the Queen of England walking toward them down a stable aisle. I-39. Martin Van Buren Bates was a Kentucky Civil War soldier who stood 7 feet and 2 inches tall and reportedly had feet that dragged along the ground when he sat in a standard cavalry saddle. After the war ended, Bates decided he wanted to find a partner and set a very specific requirement for himself. He wanted someone taller than he was. He actually found her. Anna Swan of Nova Scotia stood 7 feet and 5 inches tall, and the two of them married, toured with a circus, built an enormous custom house in Ohio with oversized furniture, and lived together for years. Bates started with what seemed like an impossible standard, and somehow Kentucky delivered. 40. The entire world's supply of Post-it notes came from a single 3M plant in Cynthiana, Kentucky for years, and almost nobody outside of that small town knew it. Yet every sticky note placed on a refrigerator, laptop, office document, or bathroom mirror across the entire planet was manufactured in one Kentucky facility until 1990, when the patent expired and production spread elsewhere. Cynthiana, Kentucky was quietly keeping global office organization running, while receiving essentially no credit for it. The town produced one of the most universally used office products in human history, and its contribution to the sticky note went almost entirely unacknowledged by the billions of people who use them daily. 41. Cumberland Falls in Kentucky does something that no other waterfall in the entire Western Hemisphere does, and it only happens under very specific conditions that require patience and good timing to witness. On clear nights when the moon is full and positioned correctly, the mist rising from the waterfall creates a complete rainbow, lit entirely by moonlight rather than sunlight. Scientists call it a moonbow, and it appears in full arching color over the falls just as a daytime rainbow would, except it is being powered by reflected lunar light at midnight. Kentucky has a waterfall that produces moonlit rainbows, and it shares this distinction with essentially nowhere else in the Americas. 42. When Kentucky needed its very first governor, the legislature selected Isaac Shelby, and Shelby's immediate response was to tell everyone he did not want the job. His stated reason was that he considered himself too old for the demands of executive leadership. Shelby was 41 years old at the time, so the entire legislature refused to accept his refusal and spent considerable energy pressuring him until he finally agreed to serve. Shelby went on to govern Kentucky and later came out of retirement to lead troops in the War of 1812 at the age of 62, which suggests that his concerns about being too old at 41 were perhaps not entirely well-founded. 43. The Kentucky Derby has been running every single year since 1875, which means it predates the telephone, the light bulb, the automobile, the airplane, and essentially every technological development that defines modern life. The race was already an established tradition before Alexander Graham Bell made his first call and before Edison lit his first bulb. Americans were gathering in Louisville to watch horses race before anyone had ever heard recorded sound or driven a motorized vehicle. All of that history and tradition and pageantry builds toward a race that is completely finished in under 2 minutes, making it one of the most elaborately prepared 2-minute events in the history of American sports. 44. Garrett Morgan was born in Paris, Kentucky, and before most people had ever seen a car navigate a busy intersection, he invented the 3-light traffic signal that the entire modern world still uses today. But the traffic signal was not even his most dramatic contribution to public safety. Morgan also invented a breathing hood that functioned as an early gas mask. And when workers became trapped in a smoke-filled tunnel disaster under Lake Erie, he did not just send the device to the rescue crews. He put it on himself, walked into the tunnel personally, and helped carry survivors out. A Kentucky man invented 2 safety devices and then used one of them in an actual emergency rescue. 45. Belle Brezing ran the most famous and reportedly most elegant brothel in Lexington, Kentucky for decades, and the building she operated out of had a history that made the whole situation considerably more complicated. The property had previously been the childhood home of Mary Todd Lincoln, the future First Lady of the United States. Brezing built such a colorful and well-documented reputation in Lexington that author Margaret Mitchell later used her life as direct inspiration when creating a character for Gone with the Wind. A Kentucky madam operated her business in a future First Lady's childhood home and then got immortalized in one of the most famous American novels ever written. 46. Kentucky waited 111 years after the 13th Amendment. Abolishing slavery became the law of the United States before officially ratifying it. The amendment passed in 1865 and was adopted by enough states to become federal law almost immediately. Kentucky looked at the situation and declined to ratify it, then kept declining. The amendment was already settled law, already enforceable, already in effect across the entire country for over a century. Kentucky finally got around to formally ratifying it in 1976. The same year America was celebrating its bicentennial, making it one of the last official acknowledgments of something that had legally been resolved since the end of the Civil War. 47. Ale 81 is a ginger citrus soda invented in Winchester, Kentucky in 1926, and it has spent the following century being almost completely unavailable outside the state's borders. The company made a deliberate choice to keep distribution local, and Kentuckians responded by treating the soda with an intensity of regional loyalty that most national brands would pay enormous sums to manufacture artificially. Kentuckians who move to other states have it shipped to them in cases. They bring it as gifts when visiting family, and they describe it to outsiders with the kind of reverence usually reserved for something irreplaceable. Winchester, Kentucky accidentally created one of the most devoted regional beverage fan bases in American food history. 48. Old Louisville is a neighborhood of 48 contiguous blocks filled with ornate Victorian architecture built during the late 19th century, and it is the largest preserved Victorian neighborhood in the entire United States. The houses are enormous, elaborate, and packed with the kind of decorative detail that takes years to restore and decades of investment to maintain. Architectural historians consider it one of the most significant collections of Victorian-era residential construction anywhere in the country. Despite that distinction, Old Louisville remains almost completely unknown to anyone living outside Kentucky, meaning one of America's greatest architectural treasures has been sitting in plain sight in Louisville for over a century, while the rest of the country remained largely unaware it existed. 49. Kentucky had a law on its books requiring every male resident over the age of 18 to practice with a bow and arrow at least once per year to maintain what legislators described as combat readiness. The law was written in an era when that kind of preparedness made some practical sense, and then sat in the legal code collecting dust through every subsequent decade of American history. Kentuckians were technically obligated to pick up a bow annually long after rifles, then machine guns, then nuclear weapons had fundamentally changed what combat readiness actually meant. The law stayed in place for decades before anyone bothered to look at it long enough to remove it from the books. 50. Kentucky chose the northern cardinal as its official state bird, and the choice would feel more meaningful if the northern cardinal did not also live comfortably in 41 other American states. The bird is common, widely distributed, and familiar to essentially every person living east of the Rocky Mountains. Kentucky is globally famous for its horses, its bourbon, its unique geography, and its extraordinary biodiversity, but when the state sat down to pick a single bird to represent all of that, it landed on the same red bird that Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Virginia, West Virginia, and North Carolina had already claimed. Kentucky chose the least exclusive bird available and made it the official symbol of a genuinely distinctive state. 51. Mammoth Cave in Kentucky has been explored continuously for over 200 years, and researchers have mapped more than 420 miles of passages, making it the longest cave system ever discovered on Earth by a margin that is not even close. The next longest cave system in the world is less than half its size. Scientists who have spent careers studying Mammoth Cave believe the fully unexplored portions may double the known length, meaning there could be over 800 miles of cave underneath Kentucky that nobody has ever seen. The largest cave on Earth is still actively getting larger every time someone goes back inside to look around. 52. Kentucky has a town called Monkey's Eyebrow, and residents have been defending that name for over a century with complete conviction, despite having no single agreed-upon explanation for where it came from. Multiple origin stories exist, and none of them have ever been officially confirmed. Some involve the shape of the land, some involve local folklore, and some involve explanations that raise more questions than they answer. Every version is bizarre in its own specific way. The town has existed long enough that multiple generations of residents have grown up, moved away, and spent the rest of their lives explaining to confused outsiders that yes, they are genuinely from a place called Monkey's Eyebrow, Kentucky. 53. Frederick Vinson became the 13th Chief Justice of the United States, one of the most powerful legal positions in the country, and his origin story begins in a jail. Vinson was born inside a jailhouse in Louisa, Kentucky, because his father worked as the county jailer, and the entire family lived within the jail building as part of the arrangement. He spent his earliest years growing up inside a functioning correctional facility, went on to study law, climbed through the ranks of American government, and eventually presided over the highest court in the land. The man who sat at the top of the American justice system literally started his life inside one of its buildings. 54. Kentucky is one of the most bourbon-soaked states in America, home to the majority of the world's bourbon production, internationally recognized for its distilling heritage, and deeply associated with whiskey in virtually every cultural context imaginable. The state's official drink is milk. Not bourbon, not Ale 81, not any of the dozens of beverages Kentucky actually invented or perfected or made famous across the world. Milk, the same official state drink chosen by 21 other states with no particular connection to dairy. Kentucky sat down to officially represent itself with a single beverage and selected the one option that communicates absolutely nothing specific or distinctive about Kentucky whatsoever. 55. Black Mountain is the highest point in Kentucky, standing at 4,145 feet, and reaching the summit requires more than just a willingness to hike. Some visitors must sign a liability waiver before they are permitted to make the climb, because the land at the top of Kentucky's highest peak is privately owned by a coal company. The state's most elevated geographic point, the spot where Kentucky reaches closest to the sky, sits on corporate property, and access is granted only after paperwork is completed, acknowledging that the coal company bears no responsibility for whatever happens to you up there. Kentucky's highest point requires legal documentation just to visit. 56. A Kentucky town passed a local ordinance at some point requiring residents to smile at strangers they encountered in public, and backed the requirement with an actual financial penalty for non-compliance. Failing to smile at a passing stranger carried a $1 fine under the law. The ordinance was not a suggestion or a community campaign encouraging friendliness. It was enforceable legislation with a monetary consequence attached to facial expressions. The law remained active and technically on the books until 1988, meaning Kentucky had an entire town where your face could get you fined for the better part of the 20th century. Unhappy residents in that town were literally a legal liability. 57. Keeneland in Lexington, Kentucky is a horse auction and racing facility that operates on a scale most people outside the equestrian world find difficult to comprehend. More champion thoroughbred racehorses pass through Keeneland's sales ring than through any other auction anywhere on Earth. Buyers fly in from Europe, the Middle East, Asia, bringing across the Americas specifically to bid on horses sold in Lexington. A single yearling at Keeneland has sold for over $16 million. The most important horse marketplace on the entire planet is not located in England, Ireland, Dubai, or Japan. It is located in central Kentucky and has been quietly dominating global thoroughbred commerce for decades. 58. In the 1800s, doctors became convinced that the cool, stable air inside Mammoth Cave held genuine therapeutic properties capable of curing tuberculosis, and they acted on that belief with complete institutional confidence. A hospital was constructed inside the cave, and patients with tuberculosis were moved underground to live there for extended periods. They ate, slept, and spent their days in the darkness of the cave believing the air was healing them. But the treatment did not work. Most of the patients who moved into the underground hospital died there. The cave that is today celebrated as a geological wonder was once a tuberculosis ward where well-meaning doctors sent dying patients underground and watched the theory fail in real time. 59. Daniel Boone kept detailed journals throughout his years exploring and settling Kentucky, and inside those journals is a passage describing an encounter with a large, unidentified creature he referred to as a Yahoo while crossing through the wilderness. Boone described the creature in enough physical detail that researchers who study unexplained wildlife encounters have cited his account as one of the earliest recorded Bigfoot-adjacent reports in American history. The man most responsible for opening Kentucky to European settlement apparently encountered something in the woods that he could not identify, gave it a name, wrote it down carefully, and then kept moving as though discovering an unknown creature was simply another item on the daily frontier checklist. 60. The New Madrid earthquakes of 1811 and 1812 were the most powerful earthquakes ever recorded in the history of North America, and their epicenter sat right along the Kentucky border, close enough that the destruction inside the state was severe and immediate. The ground liquefied in certain areas. The Mississippi River reportedly ran backward temporarily. Church bells rang from the vibrations in cities as far away as Boston and Washington, D.C., and scientists today estimate the largest of the New Madrid quakes would register between magnitude 7 and 8 on the modern scale. Kentucky was sitting directly next to the most catastrophic seismic event in American recorded history, and the shaking reached the East Coast without losing enough force to stop the bells from ringing. 61. The first time Americans ever heard Beethoven's First Symphony performed live, it did not happen in a grand concert hall in New York or Boston or Philadelphia, where most people would assume such a cultural milestone would occur. It happened in a tavern in Lexington, Kentucky in 1817. A small group of musicians gathered in a drinking establishment in the middle of Kentucky and introduced the American public to one of the most celebrated composers in European history. Lexington, Kentucky was the location where America's relationship with Beethoven began. And that fact has been sitting quietly in music history for over 2 centuries, while bigger cities took credit for the country's classical music culture. 62. Pikeville, Kentucky is a small Appalachian city that leads the entire United States in per capita Pepsi consumption by a margin significant enough that researchers have actually studied it. The people of Pikeville drink more Pepsi per person than anyone else in America, and nobody has produced a fully satisfying explanation for why. Local loyalty to the brand runs deep and has for generations. Pepsi has acknowledged the phenomenon. Journalists have investigated it. Economists have speculated about distribution patterns and regional taste preferences. A Pikeville keeps drinking Pepsi at rates that dwarf every other American city, and the definitive explanation for why one small Kentucky town became the per capita Pepsi capital of the nation remains completely unsettled. 63. Kentucky has a weapons law still sitting in its legal code that bans the concealed carrying of any weapon longer than 6 feet, and the existence of that specific measurement raises questions that the law itself does not answer. A short knife concealed on your person presents no legal issue under this particular statute. A standard firearm is fine, but anything approaching sword length triggers the restriction and requires you to carry it openly if you must carry it at all. Kentucky lawmakers apparently gathered at some point, looked at the full spectrum of weapons a person might conceal on their body, and decided that 6 feet was the length at which concealment became an official problem worth legislating. 64. Bill Monroe was born in Rosine, Kentucky, and over the course of his career invented an entirely new genre of American music that did not exist before he created it. He called it bluegrass, drew from old-time Appalachian string music, gospel, and blues, and built something distinct enough that it became its own recognized category of American cultural expression. The state of Kentucky is nicknamed the Bluegrass State, which sounds like a tribute to Monroe's invention, until you learn that the nickname actually refers to a specific grass species that grows in Kentucky's pastures. Monroe invented a genre named after his home state's nickname, and the nickname was never actually about the music at all. 65. Fort Herod was a tiny Kentucky settlement in 1777 that found itself under repeated attack, and the people inside made a collective decision that defined the future of the entire region. Surrounded by hostile forces and facing odds that gave any rational person strong reasons to leave, the settlers at Fort Herod held their position through every assault. Historians consider the successful defense of Fort Herod the moment Kentucky's settlers stopped treating the land as temporary and committed to permanent residence. A small group of people in a wooden fort made a decision to stay when leaving was the logical choice, and that stubbornness became the foundation on which the entire state of Kentucky was eventually built. 66. The Shaker Village of Pleasant Hill. Outside Lexington is the largest fully restored Shaker community on Earth, and the people who originally built it followed a religious practice that made the village's long-term survival mathematically impossible. The Shakers required complete celibacy from every member. Nobody born into the community, nobody raised there from childhood. Every single person had to be recruited from outside as a willing adult convert, or the population would simply stop existing. The village grew anyway, thrived for decades, attracted converts in surprising numbers, and then eventually did exactly what the math always predicted it would do. It ran out of members and quietly became a museum of a community that believed strongly enough to build everything except a next generation. 67. The longest frontier siege in American history lasted 13 days at Fort Boonesborough in 1778. And the defenders inside were massively outnumbered by British Allied forces who fully expected the settlement to surrender quickly. The attackers tried direct assault, tried tunneling under the walls, and tried negotiation. None of it worked. The small group inside Fort Boonesborough held out for nearly 2 weeks against a force that had every strategic advantage, and eventually the attackers gave up and withdrew. Kentucky settlers in a wooden fort defeated a professionally supported military siege through stubbornness alone, and their refusal to surrender during those 13 days kept Kentucky open for American settlement at a moment when losing it was a genuine possibility. 68. Mother's Day. As Americans celebrate it today, traces back to a Kentucky school teacher named Mary Towles Sassine from Henderson, who created the holiday specifically to honor her own mother before it became anything resembling a national observance. Sassine organized celebrations, promoted the idea through her teaching career, and worked to spread the concept of a dedicated day for maternal appreciation long before florists and greeting card companies discovered its commercial potential. A Kentucky educator invented one of the most widely observed holidays in the United States, and the holiday she created to honor mothers eventually grew into a billion-dollar annual industry that generates more flower sales than almost any other single day on the American calendar. 69. Kentucky's name has been traced by linguists to an Iroquois word, and the most commonly accepted translation is something along the lines of Land of Tomorrow, which is poetic enough that most people are satisfied with it and stop asking questions there. They probably should not stop asking questions there. Linguists have identified at least 4 other competing translations of the same original word, none of which mean Land of Tomorrow, and none of which have been officially accepted or rejected. The state has been operating under a name for over 2 centuries that nobody has fully translated with confidence, and the official meaning of Kentucky remains an open linguistic argument that has never been conclusively settled. 70. Kentucky politicians in the 1800s were dueling each other with enough frequency and enthusiasm that a general law banning dueling among the broader population turned out to be completely insufficient to address the specific problem happening inside the legislature. Lawmakers had to pass a separate dedicated law banning elected officials from dueling each other, because apparently the men writing Kentucky's laws needed their own version of those laws applied specifically to themselves. The general population's duel prohibition was not enough. Kentucky's legislature looked at its own membership, recognized that its elected representatives were a particular category of dueling risk, and wrote legislation aimed directly at preventing its own politicians from shooting one another between sessions. 71. St. Big Bone Lick. State Park in Kentucky sits on top of what was essentially a prehistoric death trap that collected the remains of enormous Ice Age animals for thousands of years. Mastodons, woolly mammoths, and giant ground sloths were all drawn to the salt licks and mineral springs in that area, and many of them died there in such numbers that their bones accumulated in layers thick enough to be genuinely staggering. Early European settlers who arrived and found the site used mastodon bones as tent poles, because the bones were the largest and most readily available construction material on the ground. Kentucky has a state park built on top of a graveyard of giants, where the first visitors used mammoth bones as furniture. Kentucky gave us the happy birthday song, a cocaine bear in a mall, a city built inside a meteor crater, and a state treasurer who robbed everyone and simply walked away forever. And somehow this is just one state. If you think your state is weirder than Kentucky, drop its name in the comments right now because the Dumbest Things channel is coming for every single one of them. Hit subscribe so you do not miss what is coming next because, trust me, it only gets stranger from here.